that was a really nice introduction. Let me tell you a little bit about why I'm here talking to you today. And it was already mentioned. The question I get asked over and over is this: Nebraska? You're kidding me, right? And let me start by saying this. There was a group just like this meeting about this time last year, saying the same things that you've already heard, and asking themselves, Kansas? Are we really going to get this done in Kansas? These were the same conversations that I was a part of. And I'm here today because I'm answering the question, which I've been answering all over the place. I don't know if you saw the Daily Show.
That was great. That was great. Thank you.
The Daily Show, of all places, has talked to me about this issue. But the question on everybody's mind is, how did you do this in Nebraska? And I'm going to share that with you. But before I get started, I want to share kind of my personal journey, how I ended up where I was. I wasn't supposed to be a legislator. I just ended up being a legislator. And but there was a turning point in my life with regard to this issue, way before I even thought about being an elected official. And that was a time when I was in college. This was the mid-'90s. And I was, I'm an ag kid, right? I came to Lincoln to go to the university from a little town in Nebraska where I had 20 classmates, rural, everybody's job depended on some type of agriculture. And that was my background. I came to the university, and one day I'm sitting there and I'm studying, or at least that's what I told my parents I was doing. But I was studying, and I was in the dorms, and one of the other guys in the dorms says, "Hey, Coash, we're going down to the pen," which was short for penitentiary. I said, "Why?" He goes, "There's a party down there." And I said, what are you talking about? But that sounded a lot better than the studying I was doing. So I jumped in the car, and we went down to the penitentiary. I honestly didn't know what I was doing. I was just with some friends. We jumped in the car. We got about 4 blocks from the pen, and there's traffic everywhere. We had to park and walk. And as we're walking, I'm asking my friend, "What are we doing here?" He says, "Well, they're gonna have an execution, and we're going." And I was like, "We have to go watch an execution?" And he's like, No, they're not gonna let you in there, but we're going there because we're gonna be part of it." I thought, well, that was kind of strange. That was the first time like this issue had ever got any type of personal connection. So we walk up into the parking lot of the penitentiary, and there were several hundred people there. And I remember walking, and there was some security there, and the security kind of stopped us, and they said, "Hey, which side are you guys on?" And then we all kind of looked at each other like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "You here for it or against it?" And we all looked at each other, and I said, "For it." He goes, "Go over there." And I said, "Well, what would happen if we would have said we're against it?" He said, "We'd go over there." And in the parking lot, they had a snow fence that was separating these two sides. And I was on the side that was for the death penalty, right? And here's what was going on. There was a band playing. People were tailgating, like barbecuing. People were drinking beer. They had a clock that you might see at New Year's Eve, counting down, And we were there, and it's starting at 11. The execution was to take place at midnight, and starting at 11, they would move the minute, and people were just. You wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between what you see on a Saturday Husker game and what I was participating in, other than it was no football game. So we partied, drank beer, high five. And the other side, I should say, I wasn't there, but I could see them, and they were quiet. Some were holding candles, some were holding Bibles. And they were really just being a very quiet witness to life, right? And taking a lot of abuse from the side that I was on. And at midnight, they shot off fireworks and cheered and banged pots and pans and slammed beers and just really made a celebration of this issue. And then about 12:05, the security shoved us all away. And I went back to the dorm, and the whole way back, it just didn't feel right. You know what I mean? my heart was telling me I was not, I was raised better than I had shown that night. I was raised better than to celebrate a death in that way. And it just ate at my heart. And I just, at that moment, I said, you know what, I'm not going to be part of that anymore. And I didn't go off and join the Nebraska Coalition Against the Death Penalty. It literally went out of my mind following that, you know. But that was 1995, 94. So we're talking 20 years ago. Right? And, you know, just, like I said, it sat in the back of my mind. Then I ran for office. Nobody I campaigned to asked me where I was on the death penalty. Never came up. I got elected. Nobody talked about it. And then I get assigned to the Judiciary Committee. It's a very heavy lift in our state. And one of the first things that I get thrown at as a brand new elected senator was a change in the method of execution. Up until 2008, when I got elected, it was the electric chair, and there's a bill to change it to lethal injection. It comes to my committee, right? The committee where I serve. And that was the first time I was faced with that issue. And so all those feelings, all that experience I just described to you came back, and I said, you know what, I was raised better than that. I'm just not going to be a part of this. So I voted against changing the method. It passed through the committee anyway. I voted against changing it on the floor 3 times. It passed anyway. It went to the governor. He signed it. And now we have lethal injection. I was content at that point in my legislative career just to say, I'll vote against it. And I felt like, at the time, you know, I slept well at night because I thought I did what I could do, right? So that's the past. Let me bring it up to this year. As was mentioned, I didn't introduce this bill. One of my colleagues did, and he had introduced this bill over 30 times. He's going to be the longest serving legislator in our state. We have term limits now, ironically, because of him. He served 36 years, took a break, and now he's going to serve another 8. The guy is pushing 80 years old, and he'll outlive me, I guarantee you. But he introduced it faithfully for years. And what would happen when he introduced it was it would get introduced, committee would have a hearing. We have to have hearings in Nebraska, which is a little different. But we would have a hearing. The committee usually would promptly squish it. Or if it made it out of the legislature, out of the committee, onto the floor, the legislature would quickly squish it. And that happened 30-some times. And he never gave up. But it wasn't going anywhere, frankly. And I'd sat through those debates, and I was one of the handful of people that voted to abolish it, but it never worked. This year was different. This year, I don't know what it was, but I made a conscious decision. I wasn't going to be content with just voting to abolish the death penalty. I was going to actually work for it. You know, I was going to put some muscle on it. Use more than just the one vote that I had. So I engaged in the issue. And so part of what I did, and this is what I'm excited to share it with you, is I started to look at what had been going on for 30-some years, and what could I do that would be any different, right? Well, here's what had been going on for years. The death penalty, as a institution, whatever you want, as a government program, whatever it was, had been framed as, this is a thing that, this is an institution that affects minorities more than non-minorities. That was the narrative. This is an institution that affects those with means differently than those without means. In other words, if you got in trouble and you had money, you probably weren't going to be on death row. But if you got in trouble, did something, and were poor, you probably could end up on death row, right? It had been framed in that way. It had been framed in a way that said, if you have somebody on death row, you might put somebody innocent to death. Well, at the time we had 11 people on death row. Not one of them ever said they were innocent. Not one of them was innocent. They had all been justly convicted of their crimes. Nobody doubted that they did what they were convicted of doing. But that was the narrative that kept coming. You're going to put somebody that was innocent to death. And so those two narratives weren't working. But that was the only thing that was trotted out there for decades in our state was, this is This is the right thing to do because we might put somebody to death accidentally, or we might, it's not fair, right? Not fair. Well, what I decided to do is I said, we're going to change this narrative. We're going to change the narrative of what the death penalty is in our state. The example that I gave you, there was only one other execution following that. It was like in 1987, a couple years later. So in Nebraska, I could go to my colleagues and say, we're darn near 20 years past the last time we've executed someone. Say, yep, it would be. I said, doesn't that sound like broken government? Doesn't that sound... Now, let me back up a minute. I'm a Republican, okay? Which is... And 3 out of 4 of my colleagues, give or take, are also Republicans. And this year, we ushered in a bunch of new Republicans who just got off the campaign trail. And I started to take what was the death penalty. We lined up everything that it is. And then we put it up against what we had all campaigned on as Republicans. I said, let's just see if these two things match up. Let's see if what we said we were when we went out and campaigned and tried to get votes is the same or matches up with this idea of capital punishment. So the first thing we looked at was we're supposed to be the party of limited government, the check on getting too powerful a government, right? When we put the death penalty up against that value and we started to say, you know what, that's a lot of power for state government. That's a big power we're giving them. Aren't we supposed to be the one that's saying, hold on a second, this is too much power for one branch of government or government itself? Aren't we supposed to be for the taxpayer? Didn't we tell the taxpayers, you send me to Lincoln and I'll cut government waste, I'll save you money, and I'll make sure that we do things that work? But yet we hadn't executed anybody in almost 20 years. Tell me how those two things change. I looked at my own campaign literature that I used when I campaigned. I looked at the campaign literature of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Everybody, in order to get elected, and the elected officials in this room will tell you, we tell the constituents what our goals are when we go there. And a big goal of myself and a lot of my colleagues was, I'm going to fix broken programs. You send me to the Capitol, I'll find, I'll root out, I'll get rid of any government program that's not working. And if it's not working, you can count on me. I'll get rid of it because you as the taxpayer deserve that. Well, how does the death penalty line up with that? Didn't make any sense, right? Some of my colleagues, myself, I put in this category, trotted out campaign literature that said I'm pro-life, right? That's my value life. I'm not in charge, God's in charge. He decides when people are born. He decides to call people home. How does the death penalty jive with that? I have to tell you, that wasn't the most effective argument, okay? But it worked for some people. What else did I tell them? Oh, justice, right? I'm supposed to be about justice, right? And isn't government supposed to deliver a measure of justice, on behalf of its citizens? Well, I got to meet a woman throughout my legislative career, and her brother was her brother was dead. Her brother's killer sitting on death row in Nebraska. And I'll spare you the details of the crime, but they're pretty horrific, as those crimes that put people on death row are. And her brother's killer is sitting on death row, and she talked to me several times, and she said, Senator Coash, when something horrible happens to your family member, and the state, because it's not family against the killer, it's the state of Nebraska against the killer, right? And she said, when the state of Nebraska says to me, because of what happened to your brother, we're going to take this guy and we're going to put him to death. And 20 years goes by, 25 years goes by, and that sentence is never carried out. You have to tell me how I'm supposed to think that's justice. And I thought she was right. Now, I'll be honest with you, that was her story. She tells it just like I would tell you. Not every victim's family feels the same way, but that's how she felt. And so I would talk about her, because on the floor of the legislature, and I'm sure it will happen here or has happened here, whenever you talk about capital punishment, it's the crimes that get talked about. Somebody will stand up and recount in excruciating detail the crimes that happen to put somebody on death row. And those are hard to combat, right? Because they're true. But the real turning point in Nebraska, and this is my message to you today, was a coalition who got around the idea, not that it was just not just equal justice, but this is bad government. This is just inefficient government. This is government that's not delivering what it's supposed to the people. So we were able to change that narrative. Okay? And we changed the narrative so that it became a conservative thing to do to abolish the death penalty. Right? Now, everybody that voted in Nebraska, some voted for it for the reason, different reasons than I voted for. It didn't really matter, but we had a coalition that said, whatever reason brings you to the table is a good enough reason, and we can work together on this thing, right? So we took a small minority who had working with this issue for years, decades, changed the narrative and added a bunch of people. We changed the narrative and a bunch of people got on board and said, now you've given me a good reason to vote for the abolishment of the death penalty, right? Now, my Democrat colleagues, and we're all friends, you know, they give me a hard time to this day. They say, well, it only took you guys 40 years to come around. But we're glad you finally came around. And they didn't really care what reason we used, but they were happy that we did this. And I would go to meetings like this and talk about it, and I did. We would have strategy meetings, and it was a pretty cool thing, very odd thing, I have to tell you. I go to these meetings, and one of the Catholic bishops in Nebraska would be sitting here, right next to the executive director of the ACLU. And they'd be talking about how they're going to work together. That was a pretty surreal thing to see. I should have taken a picture of it. But here's my message to all of you, right? And I had a great morning talking with some of your elected officials about sharing the same story. We were sitting here a year ago and people were saying, this isn't going to happen in Nebraska. I mean, this is Nebraska, right? But I truly believe, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out. A lot of things came together. But I want to tell you quickly, one of the key points of how we were able to do this, and without getting too technical about my role and things like that, but what I would do, you know, I was kind of the inside guy, right? And then I had a partner on the outside that would be, you're married, right? I had Stacy, right? And she was outside the glass, and she was we just partnered up, right? And my role was to talk to legislators and figure out where they were, right? And if I found out that, you know, I talked to one senator and he said, God, you know, you're right, Coash, this is a broken program. Maybe we should get rid of it, you know? Maybe we should save some money, you know? Or, you know, another senator would say, you know, this is just kind of pulling on my heart a little bit, you know? My faith is kind of trying to tell me something, you know, my heart's telling me something different than my head, you know? So what I would do is I'd take that information, I'd go out and I'd give it to my Stacy, right? And she would then use the network that you were all part of to help. So here's what would happen. I'll give you an example. I was working with a colleague, Senator Seiler, right? He's from smack dab in the middle of the state. And he had voted to move it out of committee, and we were on the first round of debate, and we were getting ready to vote for that. And I went to him, I said, hey, his name's Les. I said, Les, how we doing, right? And that's code in senator speak for, are you still there? You know, you're still going to vote yes when we need you to vote yes. And he goes, because I don't know, he goes, I'm getting holy heat from back home, you know. Because at the time, as the debate started to move, and I've told people this, I had no idea the world was watching. I didn't know you all were paying attention to what we were doing. You get in such a bubble as a legislator that you just don't pay attention. You know, it wasn't until after this was all done that I realized the significance of what we were doing. I was just kind of tunnel vision. But our governor had who was not on the same side, had identified that, and he might lose on this. So he called out his network. And boy, and he can go anywhere in the state and get TV cameras to show up and a couple hundred people to show up. I mean, he can really pull some people in and share a message much more effectively than a little state senator. So he was doing that. He was going all over the state. And if he was doing a ribbon cutting, he'd say, call your senator about the death penalty, right? That's what he was doing. And people were doing that, right? People were starting to blow up the phones and the emails of their elected officials. So back to Senator Seiler, he says, I'm just getting some heat from back home. So here's what I did. I went out and I told Stacy, I said, we need to help Les out. And the work on this issue had started decades before I ever got engaged. But she had a network, and all she had to do was send an email. And all of a sudden, dozens, maybe hundreds of Senator Seiler's constituents called him up and said, Senator Seiler, we know you're getting heat, and the governor's putting heat on you, but we got your back. And don't forget, you represent us too. And when you vote to abolish the death penalty, that's how we want you to vote. Because the governor, we're friends, but he's dead wrong on this issue. But he was out there saying, not one Nebraskan thinks that this is a good idea. This is Nebraska, we believe in justice. And he said that so much, people were starting to believe it. I mean, I was starting to believe it. I was starting to believe it. I was the only guy in the whole state that thought this was a good idea. Right? Because that's all I ever heard from the opponents of the measure, was that I was crazy off my rocker and the only guy, right? And so you hear that enough, you start to believe it. Well, when I would tell Stacy, go help Senator Seiler, she would call it out, and then I'd come back a couple hours later, I said, you hear me? He goes, I had every preacher, every nun, every single community leader call me, and I'm good. I said, all right. But that's what it took, right? And I have to tell you, not once during the debate did I talk about disparate justice. Not once did I talk about the crimes. Not once did I have to stand up there and defend, and I called them these jokers on death row. I didn't have to talk about those things, because what I was talking about was broken government. And I was talking about how we were going to fix a broken system, right? Now, it had been a different story, I'm sure, if Nebraska had executed somebody like the year before. Then I couldn't have said it was a broken program. But you got a broken program here. You got a broken program here. And it took a big tent. Took a big tent, and that was part of what we did. What else can I tell you? What else can we talk about, Mary?
Well, I think that you have spotlighted for this group in a very graphic way what your role is going to be as 2016 rolls around. We need you to mobilize other people to pick those funds up and give the Senator Seilers of our world that support so that they can go back to Representative Becker, Representative Carmichael, and say, I'm good.
Look, the state legislatures are a small world, right? They really are. And your elected officials will tell you what I'll tell you, which is I've seen votes turn on 2 phone calls from a constituent. They will turn on 2 phone calls from a constituent. And it gets a lot. Being a state senator is the lonely place to be sometimes. You feel like everybody's against you. And when you don't feel lonely anymore, you get to be brave. Right? And like, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, everybody's got a different reason for this. All I did through my effort was give my conservative colleagues a reason. Right? They needed a reason, right? And I don't have a crystal ball, I can't read minds, but I can tell you, I knew that some of my colleagues, in their heart, they knew this was the right thing to do. Their heart was telling them, getting rid of the death penalty is the right thing to do. But their head was telling them, you got an election next month, or next year. That's what their head's telling them. And then the governor's telling them, you're nuts. The citizens don't want you to do this, right? But what I was able to do, with help, believe me, I did not do this alone, but with help was to say to them, I know where your heart is, let me get your head there, right? And in Nebraska, we're real practical. We're just like Kansans. And we're practical people, right? We're just trying to get along, you know, keep government out of our lives, move along, get done what you need to do. That spoke to my colleagues. You know, I answered this morning. These are tough. There's tough questions that come when you come to support it. I guarantee if you did a poll of Nebraskans right now and you said, should we have a death penalty? The majority would tell you yes. That's the true answer. I would hazard to say if you polled every Kansan in the state, the majority would say, well, yeah, we need a death penalty, right? And that's sometimes our heart too, saying, look, sometimes really bad things happen to people, and the only response is to do something really bad back to them, and that's the way the world works, and I'm sorry it's not always fair, but that's what we're going to do, right? But what I will tell you is when I go out and talk to people, in Nebraska anyway, and I'll ask them, you believe it, you know, they'll ask me, you know, why do you believe in death penalty or against it or whatever, and if you went and asked a Nebraskan, should you have the death penalty, they probably would say yes. But if you follow that up with, do you really want the death penalty knowing that we haven't used it in almost 20 years and it's cost you a bunch of taxpayer money? Then the Nebraskans go, nah, get rid of it. Honestly, they're so practical. Now the challenge for me is to get that message out, because the other side was just putting out pictures of victims, right? So we had to combat that with other things, and that was really a turning point for us. What else do I want to tell you? I was on the Daily Show. You saw that?
That was
It's
great.
pretty fun. I could have gone really bad, I gotta tell you. They followed me around for a day. But, check it out. It was on the Daily Show. It was on Thursday night. So, you know, look, the world's watching, right? And the tide's changing. I'm happy to have been part of what's happening in Nebraska. I'm here today so I can see the potential here. I'm going to ask you a few questions, or I'll let you guys take a question, or
Yeah, we have plenty of time
yeah,
for Q&A.
okay. Let me end with this though. A year ago, people just like you were sitting in Nebraska saying, "I don't know if we're going to get this done. We've been trying this for 30 years, 40 years. I don't know how long this effort's been in place here."
87.
Huh?
Before 87.
1987. I thought you said 87 years ago. Oh my God. 1987. So you were-
I was part of it in 87, but there was a group before me. I mean, it started before me to keep it out after the
Yeah.
ferment.
Yeah, I mean, look, same group of people coming together like this in a church basement in Nebraska. And people were saying, I don't know, you know, this is Nebraska. We had just ushered in the biggest Republican majority that we'd seen in several decades in Nebraska. You know, we had a governor who was elected on that side of the aisle as well. And, you know, and so people were really disheartened about this time last year. You know, golly, if we had a chance, it was probably last election or the one before that. But dude, now, I'm telling you what, that was like the most helpful thing, because I had 17 new colleagues get sworn in this year. And they didn't have what I had, which is the benefit of 7 years of hearing the same old thing. And I was able to tell them, look, you're going to have people come talk to you about victims. I said, listen to them. Listen about justice, you know, and all that. I said, but let me tell you what you're not going to hear much of. Now I'm going to share with you this. Ask them how much it's costing you. Ask them how much it's costing the taxpayer, right? Ask them how well it's working. You love it so much. How come you're not using it, right? So ask them that. So, one thing I did want to share with you, because this is important to understand. I had people come to me that were pretty upset with my stance on it, right? I mean, I was like popular guy, and then I'd show up trying to abolish the death penalty. Dang it, Coash, we used to like you. And I said, well, I'm sorry, we don't see eye to eye on this issue, but, and they said, you know what, you're so good at being a legislator. Instead of trying to abolish the death penalty, why don't you just fix it? You know, get rid of the appeals, do this, you know, whatever it is, change the method, why don't you just fix it? And then what do they always say? Why don't you just do what Texas is doing? How many times did I hear that? You know, just do what Texas is doing. Now, I want to tell you, because you need to be prepared for that. I'll tell you what I told them. They'd say, do what Texas is doing. I said, we can do that. I don't want to do it, but we could. Here's what you give up if you go Texas route. You give up a government who's transparent, that's transparent, okay? You give up you trade executions for a government who won't tell its citizens what they're up to. And if they won't tell you what they're up to in something heady like this, what can you trust them to do? And I'll tell you, Nebraskans, as much as some of them love the death penalty, they were not willing to let the government do something behind their back. So I just say that to you because I've done some, I was in North Carolina a few months ago, and they went the other way. They passed a bill in their state to allow their Department of Corrections to complete executions outside of any type of public scrutiny, transparent way, anything like that. They have the citizens of that state have no way of knowing what their government's doing because their legislators allowed them, hid it from them. So be vigilant on that, right? And what I always tell them, you take what you can get. If you can't abolish it, you make it transparent. Because I'll tell you what, these drug companies, they're shrinking. They're shrinking, right? They're in the healing arts. These drug companies do not want to be the next maker of the execution drug. They want to be the next maker of the drug that heals a disease, right? And if you don't have a transparent way of letting them know, because here's what happened in Nebraska, right? They were trying to get this drug from some company outside the country, and because it's a transparent process, the media can get a hold of it, groups like yours can get a hold of it. They called the drug company and said, hey, just want to let you know, if you sell this drug to the state, they're not using it at their university to test pain management. They're going to kill somebody with that drug. And what did the drug company say? Thank you, we're not going to sell that to you. Okay? I'm convinced that Texas is mixing up some juju in the basement of their prison, and they're putting it in a vial, and they're using it to execute people. We don't know. And you don't want that here. You don't want your government, no matter what side you are on, nobody wants their government doing something they can't know about. So you just have to be vigilant like this. Let me end with this, and I'll answer any question that I can. I was sitting in a room like this a year ago wondering if we could get this done. And I am convinced that you can be sitting in here celebrating getting this done a year from now. It can be done. You will be celebrating this. And it is through the work of groups like this that we'll get it done. And I look forward to coming back and celebrating with you. So